This guy, Andy, has got rid of dozens of lawns and replaced them with meadows in private gardens, but also in the botanical gardens that he's worked at, as well as some public spaces too. So I've asked him what his methods are in order that he can share his way of making sure that they're successful and ensure that you can too. There are a growing number of people who are railing against the idea of a lawn, a historically ostentatious display of wealth that showed that you could have a part of your land that was intensively managed without it having to produce a crop or anything valuable for you. But before we talk about how to do it, let's define what we actually mean by a meadow.
So in a very vague sense, a meadow is like a largely treeless environment. And that doesn't mean entirely treeless, just there's a lot of sun and not a ton of trees. Roughly speaking, in terms of plants, there's 3 types of climates. The most common is the competitive climate, which is tree smothered. Basically just plants compete with each other. It's a really good place to grow. There's a shit ton of plants. The second option is a survivalist climate. That would be like a desert or a high alpine tundra where there's kind of better diversity than a competitive climate, at least a temperate competitive climate. But that's because the plants are like just trying to live. Like they're not really competing with each other because they just want to not die. And then the third type, which is kind of different, is what's known as a ruderal climate or an early succession climate. And that occurs when there's been a large disturbance. So a landslide is kind of a classic example, but it could even be a windstorm or a giant fire or a small fire where land is cleared and the ecology is starting over. And so you get early succession plants, which are in gardening and horticulture largely ignored. Like here in the Pacific Northwest, people will say, oh, our native plants don't adapt to like new construction sites very well. And that's usually because they're using 10,000-year-old forest plants instead of these early successional ruderal plants that are built for really low nutritional value soils and really hot, sunny, low water environments, which these disturbed sites usually are. So meadows, there are natural meadows that are fully natural. They're often, in like alpine areas or a place or really shallow soil areas, a place wherever trees just can't really get going. Or where there's like large amounts of herbivory from wild animals. But a lot of meadows over, human existence have been human managed here in the Pacific Northwest. There were burning practices from various First Nations that were sort of a type of food production because it allowed for these bulbs to proliferate that they would then harvest so that they didn't get taken over by the very competitive Douglas firs.
I know that fire management as a practice is used by lots of indigenous cultures around the world in order to graze animals on afterwards, because the fresh new growth is good for herbivores like cattle or any other large herbivore that the people are farming for whatever reasons. So, but you're saying that it's also for the food crops that thrive under those conditions.
Yeah, and it was to manage the competitive plants. It also, like a lot of those plants are geophytic, like they're bulbs. So a lot of them are really adapted to fire. Like they're ready. They're ready for that. They're ready for a low level fire, not like a really hot, intense, crazy fire like we're seeing these days in the summers more, but they're ready for the low level winter burns. And so that was sort of, and it also like cut down on grass thatch, which would allow these bulbs to keep going. It was also a soil builder because it's potash, right? So, there's all these functions that it is holistic. It is something that the land was benefiting from as much as the people. These areas, there are a few still left. There are very few of them, but where they do exist, it's like rife with insect diversity. It's really quite something to behold. Yeah.
But where do you start if you have a lawn and you want to convert it into a meadow?
We use a variety of methods. depending on the site. Some of them are very slow, some of them are very fast. But in general, when you have a lawn, it's almost always going to be really competitive weed grasses, probably other weeds too. And when I say weeds, I'm generally referring to invasive plants. Like I'm not so stuck on eliminate them all, but if you want a meadow, you do want to kill as much of that as you can. Because it is going to be very competitive, and you need to foster the establishment of your new plants. I kind of look at establishing plants a bit like an organ transplant, because you are putting a living thing into a living thing, and you need to sort of foster that they don't reject. And then sometimes they do reject, and if your lung is rejecting, the doctor's not going to be like, well, let's try to force this to work. They're going to pivot and they're going to do something else, right? Because that's not hokey. Soil's alive and the plant is also alive. And so these things have to work together. And so one of the fastest ways is a cardboard sheet mulch with a new substrate on top, whether it's a rich compost substrate or a really sandy, gravelly substrate. It all depends on your climate and what you're trying to grow and what the ground underneath is doing. But you'd put a thick layer of cardboard, and then dump whatever sub on top and seed and plant into that. That gives the plants that you're seeding and planting enough time to beat those weeds. It's if you have the time, it's better to kill for longer. If you can. I understand, we need things quickly these days. But another option is tarping. So you can tarp an entire area from like March to October. That will largely kill what's under there. You could do it twice if you're patient. You can also use plywood. I often use plywood for like blackberry. These things do take maintenance over the year. You have to go back and make sure that nothing is escaping, but plywood's nice and heavy. There's solarizing, which is a little different, where you sort of take clear plastic and put it over, but you have to bury all the edges so that it's sealed, and then everything cooks in the sun. These are nice ways because they don't really do any soil disturbance. Every time you disturb the soil, you're sort of bringing up weed seeds and this type of thing. So those are all sort of methods of site preparation for the meadow itself. The other thing is, if you do have turf, flipping it over, it can be good depending on which method you use. I've also just flipped turf, laid compost, planted and weeded, and just been really consistent with my weeding. And in the right scenario, that can work too. It depends on how rich your soil is, how moist your soil is. And then in your case, where you're working with really rich soils, I might actually avoid like fabaceous plants that are going to fix nitrogen. I might try to put in a cover crop of heavy feeders like Canada rye that actually kind of suck the nitrogen out of it a little bit. There's lots of but that requires, knowing your site, knowing your plants, right? So there is a lot to go on, but if you just start with your yard and what your yard needs, you can build on that. Because I don't have all the answers. People in Virginia be like, "What do you recommend for me?" I'm like, "I don't fucking know. Google it." Like I know what to do here. Yeah. So yeah, it's really interesting though. You can't learn enough.
James Hitchmo in his plantings, he excavates the topsoil and then replaces with sharp sand. Usually because sharp sand is, river sand is usually easily available. But with that method, he either wants that you need to know where the provenance, where has that sand been kept, so that you aren't just introducing a ton of weeds.
Or salt.
Or you put it down and you wait and you progressively weed to exhaust the seed bank, because it still won't be, like my garden, if I dig it over, it will have a pretty much inexhaustible seed bank. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Which several people have said I have. But maybe cut that.
Several people. Okay.
No. And those several people, if you add them up, come to 0. So, and just to be completely clear, there are no, just because somebody might be a negative person, they're not mathematically negative. So yeah, it's because there are no people. I didn't have like one person say it and then minus one person say you don't have. Anyway, let's move on from my inexhaustible seed bank. I wish you'd stop bringing that up.
Oh my God. Yeah, right. The idea of moving soil around, but I also know that in certain climates, particularly a lot of Western European climates or Northwestern European climates, sand is really wonderful as a growing media. For us here in the Pacific Northwest, we've always had what we refer to as a sub-Mediterranean summer, which it's drier than people realize, especially in the forest. And sometimes sand can be too not water retentive for some of the things. So yeah, it's all about knowing your climate a bit. And then with climate change, it's becoming more actually Mediterranean. So that's been interesting too.
So considering the usefulness of water retention, because the mineral media is being used because it's not fertile. And when we talk about fertility or productive soils, we're talking about, and it can be measured in the amount of biomass that can be produced by a specific, like a square meter of land.
Right. Yeah.
So in the environments that you're talking about, where you're generally selecting plants from the survivalist, prepper type plants that have a basement full of canned vegetables and and all sorts of firearms and no, the survivalists or the stress tolerators that are very good at enduring unfavorable environments are the ones that you generally want in your meadow, because you're going to have a greater number of species because they don't all try and smother one another.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah, but then sometimes the xerophytes or like the extremophiles, like the guys who like the really challenging stuff, are also really hard to grow, because they're so used to that environment that if they do have too much organic matter, they're like alcoholics. They can't stop consuming and then they die. That's kind of how I look at like cactus and stuff. But yeah. So it's so many interesting challenges, and I just find it fascinating, and I hope people can hold on to that sort of inspiration when they're sort of doing this kind of work. Yeah. Yeah.
But it is worth knowing that it can take years for a meadow to reach its peak. So how do you embrace that?
I think the time thing is really interesting. I mean, it's true, we want things immediately these days, but even the human induced meadows of the like pre-industrial era also took really, really long time to sort of create, but they were created out of necessity. People didn't have a choice but to sort of wait. And a lot of the kind of meadow guys that I read about, I'm not that old, unfortunately, but I hear people of having sown plants into their meadows that they don't see for 20 years, which I just think is so interesting. But like, we live in a society where like a building goes down and a new building goes up, right? And it's just like, it's so fast. But yet these are the perfect environments to start making meadows because they create themselves. They just make themselves, but we could alter them in ways that are a little bit better for us. We just have this idea that like that's not nature, or that can't be nature, or that somehow isn't appropriate in the city or something like that. And I think so. We do have to sort of play that game, of like what can we do quickly and impressively. That's why I'll often put like live plants plugs into my meadow plantings, just to get something going faster, so because I do have that barometer for myself, like it's got to be pretty this year. But it might not be pretty like to me, but to the average person, you know what I mean? Because I know what's coming later, but
I think it's okay to have something improve.
yeah,
But at the same time, you need some early success.
totally. And I kind of, I think people get really discouraged because of how long these things take when that kind of thing happens, right? But yeah, it's a learning opportunity, There was a time when everything took this long, like every single thing you did took this long. But like it's like our society has gotten to a point where things are really efficient and convenient, which is great. But like nature will never be that, or like plants will never operate quite on that system, or they can operate on a fairly fast system, but that requires knowledge and understanding of the plants that are available to you in your area. And so, yeah, it's fascinating.
And if you think that sounds complicated and you'd benefit from the guidance of an expert,
I do like plant consultations as well, where I just talk people through things, and I just feel like I'm a cheerleader. Like I'm like, you can do it. I think that's the most valuable thing people get out of it, is really like my belief that it works, because it does. Yeah.
And are you still doing the online plant consultations?
Yeah, I'm willing to do them. We've gotten busier and busier. Holy cow! But yeah, I'm willing to do those just to sort of get people excited. Yeah.
So in summary, what else would you say would be important for somebody wanting to convert their lawn into a meadow?
First of all, know your land, get to know what the soil's like. Actually get in there and feel it. Like so often people are just like, Andy, how often should I water? And I'm like, I don't know, stick your hand in the ground, finger it, just like, how to do it, put it in, like figure it out. Is it organic? Is it minerally? There's sort of tests you can do to play with your soil. Get to know your native plants, not because I'm like, oh, that's us. There it is. Look at that sticker. Yeah, that's us.
I fingered it, and it did need water.
It did need water. Yeah, and get to know your native plants, not because I'm going to tell you to only plant native plants, but because they're probably going to do pretty well for you. You're probably going to have to not look at your local nursery. You're probably going to have to do a deep dive Google search to sort of figure out, because your climate, no matter where you are, is going to have drier sites and wetter sites and all of this. And sort of getting to know those microclimates of where you live. Then, if you do want to introduce exotic plants, you can think, I don't know. I know that things in this part of the world will also do well, maybe in my part of the world. Like we're starting to see with climate change that like drier and drier stuff, we're getting stuff like from Southern Oregon and Northern California that's doing better and better. And so it's kind of interesting to play with those kind of ecotones, right? Because ecosystems are not cut and dry. They're all spectrums, like everything. So really just, I look at it like kind of like the soil is like a person in a way. Like, it has these qualities, it has these temperances and these likes and dislikes and body parts and like pains and aches and all this stuff. And I look at individual plant species in a very similar light. So, I mean, I'm anti-personification when it's not science-based, but I'm pro-personification when it's science-based, I guess.
Yeah, I like that analogy because they're both really complicated. And we are doing our best with the information that we have available and then experimenting and seeing how it can be put into practice.
Exactly. And I love to spend time in it and think of it as an ongoing process. Like I have my billable hours where I'm like, okay, I have to get shit done. But I also just like, will like, if it's appropriate and I'm able to, I'll just like sit in a client's garden and not bill them for it, but just like sit in it. And just, I actually think that is when I'm like most thoughtful and creative about the garden. And I'm like noticing things. I would say that like arguably I could bill for it because I'm really putting in a strong effort to it, but I don't because capitalism and stuff. But by the way, my company is called Taurus Land Care. You live in the Vancouver area, give us a shout. Anyway, that's now in there. Yes, look, there it is. Haha. Amazing. Now the sun's out and I'm going to start to get sunburned.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I've got the whole 45-minute unedited chat that I may upload to somewhere. And if I do, then I'll put it here if it's something that people express some interest in, because it was quite a funny conversation. And you can see me doing some cringeworthy arse kissing and showing my general inexperience at interviewing by being annoying and interrupting way more than I thought I did. And I'll include Andy's contact details in the description, but also some of the other resources that I've used in the past to educate myself about meadows. For instance, James Hitchmo's Sowing Beauty, which I would recommend to absolutely anybody who wants to start some sort of species-rich grassland wherever you are in the world. Once again, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this and took something useful from it, and I'll see you again soon.